Hello, everybody. As you can see, it's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to have you in this very interesting times. I am sharing the room with today's guest coming from afar, Professor Chisako Masuo, who will act as a discussant to a book presentation by Professor Axel Berkofsky, who teaches at the Department of Political Science in the University of Pavia, and who has conducted extensive archival research on, especially on German documents, East German documents, concerning the relationship between the GDR and the People's Republic of China during the Cold War. This is part of the EU-Asia project, and we are glad that we can extend our conversation at the Robert Schuman Center, not just to policy-relevant contemporary issues affecting Europe and Asia. And when I say Asia, I mean also Asia on its own merit. So this is also a Copernican revolution for the UI that has extended and expanded and broadened its horizons to focus on Asian matters from the perspective of domestic and international topics pertaining Asian states and polities. But in this particular case, we are glad that we will delve into a historical study. And of course, there are policy implications because one of these actors, as stressed by Axel in his book's introduction, is still here with us while the other has disappeared. And we are very glad to have you, Axel. And without further ado, we'll try to make the most of this book launch, which will also be a conversation with Professor Masuo, who is an associate professor at Kyushu University and research fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs, and is a prominent expert on China matters, also historical matters in Japan. So without further ado, Axel, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giulio, for this, and I will be very brief. First of all, thank you for inviting me, Giulio, and looking forward to seeing you in Florence tonight, because this is where I really live, and now I'm in Pavia. But I will, after this, I will dash back to Florence to join you and Chisa for a drink, and then we'll see what happens. So, thank you for this, Giulio. Just to, a few words, and I will leave the criticism and the comments to Chisa, and then I will, as we agreed, I will respond to this later. Why a book on China-GDR relations? Because there's nothing on the market on this in English, and I thought a couple of years ago, I've done this in 3.5 years roughly. As a German Asia scholar, this is the book I must write. This is a book I must write, and I'm in Pavia. I'm a historian. I've worked a lot on the Cold War in Asia, the idea to write a book on something that nobody has really written on, at least I thought was a good idea. Whether the book is good, that remains to be seen. We'll see how many people will read that book. But as Giulio said in his introduction, is that I did indeed use a lot of archive material for that book, a lot of archive material that nobody else has used and has put together. So I think I did something that can be referred to as original, because it hasn't been done before. And the idea was to cover the relationship between two countries which started off as allies after World War II. Then throughout the course of the Sino-Soviet split became enemies. First frenemies, and then enemies, and then ideological rivals. And then, which again turned back into friends in the late 1980s, when it was already too late, for the GDR to hope that it would continue to exist, and then the rest, of course, is history. So it's an attempt, I'd say, to describe, to analyze, what both East Berlin and Beijing were talking to to each other about what they were thinking about each other, how they perceived themselves, how, for example, you know, the East German leadership perceived the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, you know, how the East German side perceived, you know, Mao's revolutionary policies in Asia, in Africa, so on and so forth. So, you know, an attempt to read everything that there is to read about you know, Chinese East German relations, you know, and thereby taking advantage of the fact that that there is, you know, a lot of archive material available on that bilateral relationship. Archive material written in German. I've used also Chinese archive material, but above all, I've used East German archive material, which sometimes, as I also, you know, write in my introduction, is sometimes or very often very painful reading for, you know, German mother tongue, you know, scholar, because, you know, of course, it's a lot of propaganda. You know, I'd say 90-something% of the archive material I've read, you know, on exchanges, when they're talking to each other or about each other, is dominated or driven and defined by government propaganda. So sometimes it was, you know, and of course very repetitive. And I was looking into, of course, a lot of, you know, newspaper articles covering, you know, or East German newspaper articles in which, you know, the relationship with China was being analyzed. You know, and sometimes it is, you know, the articles and what was written in the articles, and when they talk to each other, but more importantly, when they talk about each other, you know, it's very repetitive. So it's not always easy for somebody like me, who could not only read the articles, but also read, you know, in between the lines, you know, as a German mother tongue. So, but it was interesting all the same, because, you know, I think that I put together, the book is coming out now. It's first online, and then in a couple of weeks it will be also available as a hard copy, published with, as you know, with Springer in Germany and here in Italy. And it's, you know, 300 pages long. And, you know, I think in all modesty, if you want to know anything about what the GDR, the DDR in German, and you know, the PRC did with each other and said about each other, you might want to have a look at this book. You know, I'll leave the rest to Chisa. I will get back to her, and I'm also very happy to see a lot of my students, you know, tuning in to this conference, and also a lot of colleagues. I see Marie from Stockholm. I see Patrick from Stockholm. You know, they're all friends of ours. But I'm also very happy to see many of my students here, who are of course obliged to show up. Otherwise, I would fail them. You know, but I'm sure that some of them also show up because they're very genuinely interested in what I have to say. And I'm also very much looking forward. Last sentence on looking forward to hearing what Chisa has to say about the book. Chisa has been here in Pavia 2 weeks ago. She is you know, one of Japan's top scholars, you know, in Japan on the Cold War, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing you know, what she has to say at the book, and the idea, Giulio, I think that's the way we agreed, that she will talk and I will reply, and then we will turn this into a conversation. Right? Thank you very much again, everybody, for showing up on this occasion. Really much appreciated. And next time we do it in person. Thank you very much. Over to all of you. Okay, over to you.
Have you had a chance to read the book?
Okay.
If not, perhaps we can ask, would you like to give us an overview of what you read?
So overall comments,
Yes.
and probably we have about 1.5 hours.
Yes.
So,
Axel, we should probably introduce his book in more greater detail. I guess this was the plan initially, but yeah, if you could like start the conversation, that's okay, because Axel can actually respond as well if you have the chance.
okay. So Axel, well, I've never read any book like this before. He went in detail how this China-GDR relations evolved over the years. when during the Cold War. And well, there are so many details in that book that nobody really knew behind the curtain. And I learned a lot. Well, personally, I did not know so much about China-GDR relations before. Of course, as somebody who has studied Chinese foreign policy for many years, I understood how China's relations with the socialist camp have evolved over the years. But I did not know what actually happened between China and GDR. And there are several things. Well, and Axel basically tried to explain to us how these relations evolved over the years. At first, in 50s, it was well, the establishment of the relations went relatively smoothly. But when China-Soviet split happened in early 60s, it became sour. And then it became even antagonistic towards 70s. But then when it came to early 80s or mid 80s, the relationship became much better. And then when GDR was falling, collapsing, and China was having this Tiananmen Square incident, the relationship got much better again. So this is probably a marriage of convenience for sure. And he gave us many details about the relationship. But as I read to Axel's efforts, I really admire, because as somebody who has also read many propaganda documents, it's really a headache to analyze the intentions behind those propaganda words. I think Axel made a great job in this and tried to decipher the relations between the two parties, basically. I said parties because I think it was basically the relationship about the party, not on the basis on the state-to-state relationship. The socialist countries regarded that the party-to-party relationship was much higher than the state-to-state relationship, because they were doing this international communist movement. So Axel made a great job in this, but at the same time, I started to wonder why this relationship developed as this way. So I think well, to decipher the overall developments, it will be also important to understand how Chinese side actually try to use the relationship with the GDR for their interests. And because I think, from a third party's view, I think Axel made a great explanation on how this relationship has evolved. So I'm sorry, I touched the touch panel. But I think Axel has made a great account on how this relationship evolved. But it'll be very important to go one step forward and explain why this relationship evolved this way. And to understand this development, I think it is also important to look onto the Chinese side. Well, of course, there are a very limited amount of documents released from China, so it's not very easy. But Chinese Cold War historians have published many of their research documents, basically in Chinese, unfortunately. So, but if I think in the future, if you could connect with their research achievements, it'll be much more fruitful to understand why China, the bilateral relationship happened in this way. There are, so from here, maybe I can raise one question and then Axel can answer. Maybe we should convey it that way. So first I would like to ask Axel about the archives. You've read a lot of archives, but you basically listed the archives you used in that chapter at the end of each chapter. And I wasn't exactly sure how those archives relate to each of your sentences. And I was wondering, because I don't think you elaborated in detail. I was wondering which parties in both, which people or which organizations in each party contacted to each other. Because in my understanding on China's conduct of foreign relations, sometimes Chinese domestic politics gives a huge influence to its foreign policy. And when that happens, the people who contact with foreign parties change. Because, this is, well, Axel's explanation is basically on the party-to-party relationship. So it's slightly different from the relationship between the two foreign ministries. And within the party, there had been so much power struggle in China. When I was reading, I think it was a translation on Albanian leader about his relationship with China. During the course, he elaborated how his counterpart has changed. And that really reflects the changes in Chinese domestic politics. So I was wondering, behind those propaganda, if you were able to read any, for example, more detailed archives, such as telegrams, and because I was in German, I couldn't really read that part. Yeah. And well, which parties were contacting each other between the two parties, and over the years, how they changed on the Chinese side? Okay, sure. That's my first question. Okay.
Axel,
try to answer that question?
Yeah, can you unmute yourself? Okay. Axel, if you could also give us a gist, an overview of the book as well, while you address Jesus' point, that would be very helpful. If,
Yeah, okay,
yeah,
okay, I'll come back to this as well. Okay.
thank
Well,
you.
the first question is the structure of the book. You know, when you I was the editor. It made me list all archive sources at the end of each chapter. Okay, and if you look into the actual titles of the East German archive material, you will understand. But okay, if you don't speak German, but you'll understand. And I try to explain this also in the book. You know, it's a mix of exchanges between the party, you know, the propaganda department, or but it's also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, both in East Germany and in Beijing. So, and it's party to party level, ministry officials, and other groups. And you know, this is when you look at the title of the archive material, it's all in there. You know, it says, you know, exchanges, for example, between East German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the East German ambassador meeting somebody from the party's organizational department, or meeting somebody from the propaganda movement. So when you look at the title of the individual archive sources, you understand who's talking to each other. And what I did also in the chapters, in the respective chapters, I was trying, maybe not always, not in a perfect manner, but I was trying to point out who's talking to each other. Okay, very often I say East Berlin in Beijing, but in that context, I always try to be precise on who exactly is talking to each other. And of course, there are nuances, and of course, that's a good point. You know, that might be something to take into account if I want to continue publishing on that. I'm not sure whether I want to do this, but if I continued to be publishing on that, I could also take into account what you're proposing now, to try to identify and analyze, and that's why this is a very good intervention, to analyze, you know, how the tone and the quality of interaction change, depending on which actor, the East Germans, were talking to in China. But I think in the individual chapters, I was trying to make it clear, who's talking to each other. Okay, so that's. But again, that's one of the disadvantages of when you have that book and you do not read German and you do not understand what the title of the archive source. But I think they give it away who's talking to each other, and I can assure you it's as broad as possible. But I honestly, I've read everything that there is to read, and I've got everything that has been exchanged between the. This goes back, then to what Julie was saying. Everything that was being said and exchanged between the GDR and China between 1949 and 1989, and I was, and to make this goes to when I talk about the contents and the structure of the book, it is an attempt, essentially, Julia and all the others, to and that also goes back to Chisa's question, to understand why relations evolved the way they did, and of course what came in between the initially very good relations, because the satellite state GDR dominated by the Soviet Union, not equipped with with an independent foreign policy, completely dependent on the Soviet Union, following, of course, by default the foreign policy line as defined by Moscow. And when Moscow and Beijing were allies, so were East Germany and the GDR. And when you look at this, and this goes back right into the into the contents of the book, when you look at the 1950s, I started in 1949 when the GDR was founded in 1949, and when you look at the way China was being portrayed in the East German press, it was being portrayed by the ruling party and the politicians in the East Germany, you could get the impression that China in the 1950s is the milk of land and honey, because everything was great, and it's a role model socialist country. It has joined forces with the Soviet Union and all the other socialist countries in fighting global imperialism led by the US. Lots of East German delegations traveling to to China in the 1950s. You know, authors, intellectuals, you know, painting a very rosy picture of China of the 1950s, you know, and being a very close ally, you know, being geographically very distant, of course, but, you know, finding themselves on the same page, if you will, and that you know, lasted until it lasted. You know, and it became you know, until the Soviets and the Chinese split in the late 1950s, early 1960s. But for example, and this is you know, a result of ignoring reality and you know, subscribing oneself to misleading and, you know, and propaganda that is not reflecting reality. For example, when you look at the you know, and that is covered in one chapter extensively in the book. If you look at the East German perception of the great leap forward, of course, in China from 1958 to 1962, the way initially, and you know, East German propaganda, East German press, you know, the East German correspondents based in Beijing, they you know, jumped on that train, on that, you know, all is good train as regards the great leap forward. You know, China is on its way of producing, you know, record harvests. You know, China is on its way to produce more steel than Japan, the UK, and the US combined in, you know, in no time. And you know, I've looked very intensively into this, right? And you know, that there was, you know, great enthusiasm based on completely wrong statistics, on false statistics, based on propaganda. You know, East Germany, you know, for example, you know, being very enthusiastic about the Great Leap Forward, even when there were doubts about the success of the Great Leap Forward, which of course that would then turn into an epic catastrophe, you know, leading, you know, resulting in 40 million casualties in China. But you know, so there is a lot of ingenuous or very naive, you know, a very naive perception, at least in the 1950s, of what China was and how China was to be understood, you know, based on an understanding that, you know, because China is an ally, because China is an ally of the Soviet Union, because then there needs to be unity within the community of socialist countries, that, you know, that they find themselves, you know, repeating the same propaganda, very similar sounding propaganda. And, you know, the GDR, for example, in the 1950s, you know, repeating, you know, false statistics to as alleged evidence that in China is indeed, you know, on the verge of becoming an industrialized superpower, overtaking the US and the UK very, very quickly. And then, of course, would change then dramatically. It would you know, things would turn from very good to very bad when it was decided in Beijing and also Moscow that from now on, you know, Moscow and Beijing are ideological enemies. They you know, when the Soviet split broke out in the early 1960s, all of a sudden everything, and that has also been reflected in how the East German press reported on China, on what the officials said and what they said to each other, and when they, you know, started much more talking about each other than talking to each other, and a lot of, you know, hostility between East Germany and China. And that was the case when it was ordered in Washington to, from now on, to no longer, you know, consider China to be an ally, but to consider China an adversary. So, you know, and everything that was good, let's put it this way, everything that was good about China in the 1960s turned into bad in the 1960s, and that was also being reflected in the reporting on the Cultural Revolution, of course, in China. So, you know, the way the Cultural Revolution was being portrayed, that's exceptional, and I point this also out in that chapter, is being portrayed as a campaign, you know, propagating, you know, the wrong version of, or the allegedly wrong version of, you know, Marxism, Leninism, whatever that meant. It didn't really have any meaning, but, you know, and that's exceptional because the East German press and the East German policymakers, they used the failure or the chaos and the catastrophe of the Cultural Revolution as, you know, as evidence that China is practicing the wrong version of Marxism-Leninism, as opposed to reporting what it really was. It was an epic disaster. China, completely interrupting its international relations. Millions of people, starving in China, not only during the Great Leap Forward, but also during the Cultural Revolution. So a complete disaster. Throwing the country into chaos, into terror, and so on and so forth. But the East German press, at least that was my impression, was focusing, was putting its focus on its reporting on the Cultural Revolution as an event, as evidence that China is on the wrong path of Marxism-Leninism. I haven't seen a single article and a single document which would be attempting to describe Chinese realities on the ground during the Cultural Revolution. And there were, of course, East German correspondents on the ground. But with all the newspaper articles I've been looking through, I haven't found, a realistic analysis on what was going on in China during the Cultural Revolution. But I had the impression that the main focus was that the Cultural Revolution and how that revolution was practiced and executed in China is the evidence that China doesn't know what Marxism-Leninism is. And then, of course, East German, and then I stop and then maybe hand back to Chisa and the audience and to Giulio. And then, of course, East German propaganda went into overdrive when in the late 1960s, in the very early 1970s, when China and the US opened operations. That of course was the worst case scenario as far as East Berlin was concerned. Because there was still some hope in East Germany, which of course had a permanent complex of being inferior. The GDR throughout its existence from 1949 until the very end of existence in 1989 was always very concerned about its legitimacy, as a sovereign state. It always, it was the GDR was founded in 1949 with the blessing of the Soviet Union, as a second German state, and then of course an attempt by the East German government, and this is also being extensively covered in one of the chapters. When I talk about the Berlin question, and more importantly about the German question, that China expects, or the East Berlin expected, support from China, and it got initially a lot of support from China, supporting the East German myth that the end of World War II has not only created two separate German states, but indeed two separate German nations. The German question. The East Germany was insisting on the fact that there's one a peace-loving socialist German nation living in the GDR, and one capitalist bourgeois imperialist German nation populating West Germany. That was this founding myth upon which the GDR was being founded, and for over decades until West Germany, or until Beijing opted for cooperation with West Germany, until China opted for technology and investment from West Germany. China expected support from China and other socialist countries, support for its interpretation of the end of World War II, that end of World War II not only created two separate German states, but indeed two separate German nations, which of course is complete nonsense, because there's one German nation divided, which was temporarily divided by an inner German border. And the East Germany was obsessed with this, and then obsessed with making sure that there's support among the socialist countries, including China, on the German question in general, but also then on the Berlin question as well. And what I said earlier, then propaganda and paranoia, if you will, and when you look at the archive material, and when you look at, especially during that period, at the newspaper material, went into overdrive completely. When Mao Zedong and Nixon met in Beijing in the early 1970s, and when they talked about establishing relations, that of course was the worst case scenario for Berlin, as far as Berlin is concerned, because it was not about they were normally and in theory in favor. This is what I read from the from the newspaper articles. They were in favor of, of détente, of of decreased tension between the Western and Eastern world. In that sense, a rapprochement between Washington and Beijing was interpreted officially as something positive. But in reality, East Germany was very much concerned about the fact that there could be, U.S. Chinese alliance from now on, threatening the legitimacy of the bloc of communist countries in general, and also then threatening the very existence and the very legitimacy of the GDR. And if you read German, I recommend you to read some of the archive material and the newspaper articles cited. They're very repetitive. There were 250 or 300 articles on always using the same words, always having the same level of paranoia about the process of rapprochement between China and the GDR. And of course, sometimes it sounds very childish. Very often it sounds very childish because it was childish. But this is the way, this sort of a rapprochement, this process of détente was being perceived in détente between the US and China was being perceived in East Germany. And then, if I may, Giulio, then things became very peculiar again. When we moved, into the 1980s, of what happened in the 1980s. The Soviets, under Gorbachev, were talking about reforms. We're talking about political reforms, and Gorbachev was not only adopting, economic and economic reforms and structural reforms, but also beginning to thinking out loud about adopting political and social reforms in the Soviet Union. And that again was, the worst case scenario for the GDR, because the GDR, until the very end of existence, of its existence in 1989, didn't want to reform. All attempts undertaken by the Soviet Union under Gorbachev already in the 1980s to convince the East German leadership, to at least consider political reforms, to at least consider economic reforms in order not to end up on the dustbin of history too quickly, which then eventually happened in the late 1980s, were being refused in East Germany. So East Germany until the very end was opposed to anything resembling political reforms, which then of course open up an opportunity for China to once again, in the 1980s, to become, East Germany's best friend, But of course, and this is, also being reflected in the title of the book, East German-Chinese relations and the bad company you keep, this sort of attempt to hook up, with China, opposing Soviet Union-style reforms. Of course, it didn't end very well. And then when China unleashed the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, at least this is how I interpret, what I read on the sort of exchanges that were being exchanged between East Berlin and Beijing during that period. It was used. The Tiananmen massacre was also used as an opportunity in East Berlin to cement, to further reinforce, this fair weather friendship, adopted, adopted, in the last phase of the existence of the GDR. And when then in late 1989, when East German citizens started marching on the streets of Dresden and Berlin, East Berlin, and Leipzig and other cities in East Germany, there was a lot of talk in East Berlin about adopting the Chinese solution, and adopting the Chinese solution in East Germany would have been, East German authorities, East German state police, East German, armed forces replying with military force to peacefully demonstrating students, marching for regime change in East Germany in 1989. And that was also a result of the fact that, right after the Tiananmen incident, or the Tiananmen massacre, it's always being called an incident in Chinese, but really, let's call it what it was. It was a massacre. The PLA shooting into unarmed crowds on Tiananmen Square in June 1989. It was, the East German government was the first government, together with a government from Romania, to congratulate the Chinese leadership in June 1989 on its successful policy to suppress counter-revolutionary activities on Tiananmen Square in 1989. And that's why this is how this term, the Chinese solution, made it onto the equation, into the equation and onto the policy agenda of East Germans political leaders in late 1989. Of course, things would then turn out very differently. Last sentence, in East Germany, because there was no Chinese solution. Things went very quickly. There was no violence. There was no bloodshed. It was a peaceful revolution. Every once in a while in history, even Germany is capable of a peaceful revolution. Not marching into other countries' territories. And this is not the way it was supposed to be going. When people were already marching on the streets in East Germany, it became very clear very, very quickly that there would be no Chinese solution that the East German authorities and the police and the armed forces could be opting for in 1989. And there we go. The GDR vanished, and China is still around. And this is how I end this book. So it's a comprehensive attempt, to go into the nitty-gritty business of everything, essentially everything or almost everything, East German political leaders, party officials, diplomats exchanged with each other from 1949 to 1989. I hope I didn't kill you with this, and that's it. Yeah, I'll keep my mouth shut.
Thank you. No. Thank you very much. Chisa, would you like to respond or add something? Ask more questions? If so, then I'll mute myself.
Okay. I think Axel's book gives a lot of implications to the current relations between China and Germany too, but probably we can talk about it later. And going back to the history, Axel, what do you think was the decisive factor that determined GDR's policy or perception toward China? And do you think this factor changed over the years overall? Because I ask this question because on the Chinese side, I think this factor was slightly different from the way East GDR's factor. And in my view, the bilateral relations between the GDR and PRC was more influenced by the Chinese domestic politics, because basically the evolution of the bilateral history accompanied the changes in the Chinese domestic politics. But I would like to ask first about the perception from the Germany.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
So it sounded like Soviet basically decided the GDR's policy at first, but maybe over the years it changed a little bit. That's my guess, but I would like to have your idea.
Yeah. Okay. Julia, can I ask before I forget? Yeah. Okay. Because I tend to forget quickly. It's the end of December, so we'll last. No, but it's a very good question. I would say, and this is something the East Germany has insisted upon in many years. It always said, look, sure, we are an allied country. We are an allied, we are, a fully emancipated member of the socialist world, but we have our own independent foreign policy. but all the authors, I've read, non-Chinese authors and non, former East German authors I've read, they conclude that the level of, foreign policy independence in East Berlin was very, very limited from day one until the very end. It might have been different in the 1980s, but then things were already too late because, the GDR was on the verge of economic collapse anyway, and there was no way back. But until then, every once in a while, and I've looked through all of this. Every once in a while, I found documents and archive material also published on the Wilson Center, published by Chinese scholars, and this is all what I also write in the introduction of the book. I have a problem with Chinese, or often I have a problem, and I'm not the only one. I have a problem with Chinese scholars writing on the legacy of Mao Zedong and the legacy of domestic and foreign policies under Mao Zedong, because I always thought that they are assigning too much importance to what Mao was doing and saying, and without really following up on this and what it really meant for the state of Chinese foreign relations. But and some of those Chinese scholars, they also said, that's not true. China had certainly had an influence on, was able to negotiate independently and talk to East Germany independently, because the level of East German independence and international, or its foreign policy independence was much bigger than it was believed, and and you see, and they were referring also to what East German politicians were saying. Walter Ulbricht, Honecker, saying, look, they always insisted on the fact that that East Germany is an independent foreign policy actor, but in reality, and I've tried to look into this. I said, look, okay, I have an open mind. I see, I will try to detect and identify, independent East German foreign policies, throughout the Cold War, and I couldn't find anything. I really couldn't find anything, and this is also reflected in the way that, and also Giulio, you've also looked into, you work on the Cold War in Asia. Everything was good in the 1950s. China was the milk of land and honey. Everything was great, and even and funnily, or tragically, when during the Great Leap Forward, China introduced, the people's communes, the dreadful people's communes, obliging millions of peasants and their families to live together like animals in very rudimentary structures. There was some interest on the part of the East German government to introduce people's communes in the East Germany as well. But as soon as that leaked into the public, East German farmers said, look, if you do this, we will leave, and we will join the millions of people that have already fled East Germany in the 1950s, and we will be out of here right away. But there was an interest, a very naive and very awkward interest on the part of the East German leadership to even play with the idea of introducing people's communes into East Germany, which of course would have been a very, very bad idea, to put it that way. And then coming to the second part of your question, yeah, who knows? That's something that was bothering me also throughout the book, and it's still bothering me. I'm not losing much sleep over this. It doesn't bother me that much. I can tell you. But when I look at this in detail, I'm an Asia scholar, and I happen to be German, but I know more about Asia than I probably know more about Chinese history than I know, about East German history, or even the Cold War history in Germany or in Eastern Europe in general. Chinese, the reality of Chinese domestic policies from beginning to end, from 1949, since the foundation of the PRC until Mao's last breath in 1976 was chaos and destruction. The legacy of Maoism in China, there was nothing constructive about any of China's China's domestic and foreign policies. On the domestic front, there was the Great Leap Forward, the socialist re-education campaign, the Cultural Revolution, numerous purges, land redistribution reforms, creating chaos, creating misery, and creating resulting in purges, in chaos and violence. On the foreign policy front, we have the border clash with India, we have the bombing of Taiwanese offshore islands, we have the border war with the Soviet Union, we have a lot of conflicts, and we have Mao Zedong, over the decades, even during the Great Leap Forward, even during the Cultural Revolution, financing revolution or self-proclaimed revolutionary movements all over the place. But there was no coherent, Chinese foreign policy, and there was domestic policy in China in disarray, in my view, from day one until Mao's death, and until Deng Xiaoping took over power in China in 1978. And then try to make sense. This is then okay, and then you have concluded, Chinese domestic and foreign policies are messy, are very messy, chaotic, violent, and then you try to squeeze, the Chinese policies towards East Germany into this, right? And the result is, and I think I made this clear in the book also, and of course it's a very opinionated book. It's not your usual academic book, and I made this also clear in the introduction that it's it's a lot of substance, a lot of material in the book, but sometimes really had difficulties, taken seriously, not what I was writing, but taken seriously on what Chinese authorities and the Chinese political leaders said that they were doing, with other countries, including East Germany. So there was really no coherent, foreign policy towards any country, including the GDR. And vice versa, I think the only time, and that's a true story that was being cited, several times. The only time the East German leadership really got inspired by Chinese policies is when Walter Ulbricht, the leader of the GDR, met Mao in 1956. And when they talked about how to about policies and measures and instruments to keep East German citizens leaving the GDR, because we recall from 1949 to 1961, roughly 3 million East German citizens escaped to the West, and they didn't escape to the West because because life was so good in the GDR, but because life was supposedly much better in West Germany. And the only time the East German leadership got inspired when Mao mentioned the wall. He mentioned the Chinese wall during during a meeting with Walter Ulbricht. He said, why don't you build a wall? 1950s. And this is when Walter Ulbricht, started fantasizing about its wall. And this is when Walter Ulbricht, he talked to Stalin also about, a permanent border between East and West Germany to keep East Germans from escaping to the West. But then he really got obsessed with this. Then then finally he talked Khrushchev in the Soviet Union into giving him the go ahead to separate East from West Germany with a wall. That was probably maybe the only incident when the only incident in the history of bilateral relations when there was some inspiration for East German leaders coming being picked up by East Germany. But bottom line is, I have difficulties. I had difficulties, and that's not only me. I had difficulties, identifying a coherent Chinese, policy plan towards the GDR and other socialist countries. Maybe there was one. No, the underlying rationale, the underlying objective was to try to offer to East Germany and other socialist countries, an alternative to Soviet domination. Of course, the Chinese were telling the German counterparts, East German counterparts, every once in a while, look, be careful not to become too dependent. You're already very dependent on this. You're only a satellite country. You're not socialist brothers. You are, you've got a big father, a very dominant father sitting in Moscow, and you should, you should become like us. And this was also, last sentence, this was also something that that was being picked up by East German intellectuals, East German intellectuals, also even, or especially during the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, there was some level of admiration, within East German, intellectual circles for what China was doing. China was emancipating itself from the Soviet Union, had the courage to stand up to the Soviets, develop their own version, the allegedly correct version of Marxism, Leninism. And this is what we as an East German, we should be doing, because we are being dominated by the Soviet Union. We have no foreign, independent foreign policies. Our industrial development was being obstacled from the very beginning, by the Soviet Union. The Soviets dismantled our entire industry after the end of World War II. We should be more like China. But that, of course, was a very small group within Germany, within East Germany. But and I looked into this, into these materials and what they were propagating in terms of how to become a bit more like China, to become a bit more independent. But I think this was not only not sustainable, but the group among or the movement among East German intellectuals or even policymakers was so small that it really didn't make a difference. And of course, as we know, the East German Secret Service, the infamous or the notorious Staatssicherheitsdienst, they made very sure and very quickly very sure that there would be no resistance against officially ordered East German policies. And praising China, of course, when nobody else was allowed to praise China, when the official policy became in the 1960s to oppose everything that was taking place in China, everything Mao Zedong and the leader said in China became official policy. It was very, very difficult for there to be a movement within East Germany supporting the Chinese version of socialism or communism, as opposed to the version as propagated in Moscow.
Thank you. I think we could open the floor for discussion. Bless you. I will start with one small question, I imagine, a specific one. I imagine that one element of agency and autonomy in foreign policy, specific to this bilateral relationship, comes also with a degree of knowledge and independent capacity to deal with the counterparts. And so the question is, how many Chinese-speaking diplomats and officials, party officials as well, or intellectuals were there in the GDR? And conversely, what about in China? Was German actually something that was fostered among a specific branch of the Chinese apparatus? I would imagine party apparatus above civil apparatus.
Okay.
Did this translate into also a set of relationships of some sort between these communities? Because I imagine
that's right.
that the personalities must have played a role, even in terms of their expertise, allowing for exchanges, mutual exchanges. Because of course, I'm totally ignorant, and I imagine that but Russian, of course, was the language of choice for the Chinese intelligentsia, and their foreign experiences were not in Germany, but previous were in France, even in Japan. Some of them even joined Lai studied in Japan.
Okay.
So I'd be interested if some of them actually had spent time in Germany,
Okay.
before its partition.
Absolutely.
And I guess, I am opening it up for discussion. We have half an hour to go. And so not hesitate in taking, raising your hand and switching on the camera and asking all sorts of questions or even comments to Axel. Since I see nobody taking the floor, I guess you could start, but please do not hesitate. Do not be shy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. You're not at all ignorant. It's a very good question. The intelligence is very often also the ability to ask the right question, and you did. No, of course, and I'm not saying this because you're taking me out for dinner tonight. I'm saying this because this is whatever you mean. No, the answer is yes. There was, of course, a lot of there was structured research on China, and East German Chinese speakers emerging in the 1950s and in the 1960s. Of course, there was structured research on China, but the problem is that propaganda and the official policy line always came in the way. 1950s everything was good, everything was being praised, and the real experts, I wondered about this many times, how come, the East German press and the correspondents even, who were on the ground and had some knowledge on China, otherwise they wouldn't be in China, how come, they in parrots fashion reported, on the alleged success of the Great Leap Forward when it was for all to see, and not even for the experts, that it didn't work, that the Great Leap Forward, for example, didn't produce record harvest or record steel production quota, but ended in complete disaster. Okay, and there was, of course, and I've spoken to a number of East German retired sinologists who studied in China, and who told me that they had a certain level of influence on policy making in China, but I never really saw this because propaganda always came in the way. It was either very good in the 1950s until the beginning of 1960s. Everything was great, and then everything was bad. So there was, I missed, and that's why the question is very good. And maybe I have to look into this a bit more carefully if I choose to continue working on this, and then certainly something to be taken into account. But as far as I can see, the expert opinions, the analysis, coming from experts, didn't seem to have been taken into account, by East German policymakers. And even, and this is what I say several times in the book, and I'm asking myself that question: how come, the embassy the East German embassy in Berlin, they were informed on the realities on the ground. Why didn't they tell East German policymakers what was really going on in China? And it was during the Great Leap Forward and during the Cultural Revolution. Why didn't they inform themselves better? But there was, of course, structured. There was probably more research, interest in East Germany on China than the other way around. Okay, and there were exchange programs also between students and professors in the 1950s, and they resumed then again, only the 1980s. So there was a big gap, 25 years of really no such exchanges. But I always had the impression that expert opinions and expert analysis coming from East German intellectuals, East German scholars on China really didn't make it into East German policymaking, and maybe it should have, but to me it seemed like that there was very little appetite, or very little possibilities for East German policymakers to make some sense of or to make a constructive contribution to East German policymaking, because they had made up their minds anyway already earlier on what the official China policy must be. And and again, but it's a good question, because there really seems to be, and this is also being reflected in how I write in this book, and there's some level of frustration also on my side. It's like, how is it possible that East German intellectuals or East German scholars repeat the claim that China by 1961 would be able to produce more steel than Japan in the same year. That was so completely unrealistic. And if you had looked into Chinese the quality of Chinese steel production in the late 1950s, early 1960s for more than 5 seconds, you would realize that this was completely unrealistic. So there were people who knew what was going on the Chinese ground, and who knew Chinese, and who had contacts in China, and who could have made a contribution maybe to a more, sober, one way or the other, policy towards China. But that really didn't seem to have mattered, as regards the eventual policy output towards China. But drove me off the wall. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. We have Professor Patrick Ström from the Stockholm School of Economics. I'll leave the floor to you, Patrick, and please, others, raise your hand or simply switch on the camera and bombard Axel with questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julio, for arranging the seminar, and thanks, Axel, for a very interesting presentation. I was just wondering, when you were going through the archives in Germany, did you come across, and when you wrote the book, did you come across anything that you would think would irritate modern China, that things came up in the way that they handled the relationship that could kind of be a burden for future relations with certain countries, or could this just be seen as a chapter which has been completely closed in history?
Yes, I mean, yes, and I thank you, Patrick. Julia, shall I answer right away? Okay. Yes, for example, now this one chapter in the book on what I mentioned earlier about the Berlin and the German question, is that initially, I hope I get your point. I mean, I turn your point around maybe also a little bit. A lot of East Germany was obsessed, with receiving support from China on the German question, but China was very. Yeah, no, I'm not. So I'm replying to you. I got it. But then, of course, the way this was being interpreted, the way that World War II and the division of Germany created two German nations. This is the bottom line for East Germany. So one peace-loving socialist country and the West German militarists and the fascists. This is where this is where they are. So two nations. But that became very uncomfortable for that sort of interpretation or conclusion became very uncomfortable to China, and this has also been reflected, and this explains also why China then changed its position on the German question because of Taiwan. Because of Taiwan, Taiwan is that if there is a second German nation in Germany, there maybe is also this is the fear in China. This is the fear of how the rest of the world could interpret on what happened between mainland China and Taiwan in the 1940s, and with the emergence of the Republic of China, Taiwan, the second Chinese state, if you will. This is also fear that this could be interpreted, they're not only two German nations, but history has also created and changed the facts on Chinese ground and has led to to a second Chinese nation. And initially, of course, there was very little room in China because there were allies, for not endorsing the two German nation gibberish, if you will. But then when West German investments were flowing into China, when West Germany became much more important, West German investments became much more important than socialist brotherhood executed by East Germany. I think China was also very relieved, and the policymakers, especially then under the more rational policymakers under Deng Xiaoping, were also very relieved to be finally able to say, look, this is all nonsense. Sure, Germany was temporarily divided, but it didn't create a second German nation because it didn't create a second World War II, and the civil war in China didn't create a second Chinese nation either. And there was a lot of but it was also turned around. For many years, China was in favor of German reunification as defined in East Germany, because this would also be a role model, at least as far as Beijing is concerned, of how mainland China could be reunited with Taiwan. So this is also a positive aspect of this. But the negative aspect is that okay, there are two German nations, as defined by East Berlin. Let's not go down that road, because then the rest of the world might also conclude, all right, so if there's a second German nation, I mean, it sounds a bit simplistic, it sounds a bit childish, and it sounds a bit naive, but it's not my fault, because this is the way they argued, and did I answer your question more or less?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
We have a question from Chisa, and I see no other hands raised. So yeah, Chisa, the floor is yours.
Well, actually, I wasn't going to raise a question, but instead I was just to add a comment. I think there is another thing China might feel very uncomfortable about Axel's book. Is the treatment of peaceful coexistence policy. I totally agree that China applied a double standard for the unification issue to China and Germany, and probably to Korea as well. But regarding the peaceful coexistence policy, nowadays China always argued that China had been carrying that policy for more than 70 years. And it's always tried to be peaceful. And it is true that China started to held up peaceful, the 5 principles for peaceful coexistence. But and that was in 1954, I believe. But at that time, those principles were only applied to the developing countries, newly independent developing countries.
Yeah.
And gradually, when it came to, well, probably in 60s, when China started to have economic relationship with West Germany, it started to expand the target. And when it came to 70s, obviously, China started to use those principles for its relations with the United States as well. But only when it came to 1982, officially, China started to argue that those five principles can be applied to socialist countries. So that was when those principles could be applied to all the countries. So what China argues today is not really true, as Axel has illustrated clearly in this book. China was always, well, during 60s and 70s, China was always against Soviet policy for the peaceful coexistence.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so China might feel very uncomfortable because this is the bottom line of its today's foreign policy. That was my addition.
Absolutely. Of course, it was then very easy. I mean, sure, the peaceful coexistence, the way it was being proposed by the Soviet Union in the 1950s, by Khrushchev, that of course was, peaceful coexistence between the East and the West, between the USSR and the USA. But this is not the kind of peaceful coexistence Mao had in mind. Mao was all about, he was living his dream, of peaceful revolution, eternal struggle, and not coexisting peacefully with countries outside the community of socialist and communist countries. And that is, of course, the very reason why then after the missile crisis in Cuba, Khrushchev became very quickly a revisionist, a revisionist as far as China was concerned, and a traitor of the community of socialist countries, because he was proposing to coexist peacefully with countries inside the capitalist bloc, and this is something that of course is being denied today. It's always being said that in China, China has always been about peaceful coexistence and never any harmful intention towards anybody. The same way Chisa and everybody else, China was saying that it has always been in favor, and I write also about this in the book intensively, has always been in favor of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, his approach towards his reconciliatory policies towards the Soviet Union, towards socialist countries, which, however, when you look at how China initially, Mao and the people around him interpreted Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, it was perceived as very threatening, because it was perceived as a policy trying to drive the wedge even further between China and the Soviet Union, and by getting the Western world to jointly conspire against China. Then after German reunification, or during German reunification, Chinese policymakers, and I cite them extensively in the newspapers, they have given their statements and saying, look, China has always been in favor of peaceful reunification. China has always been in favor of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik and his successful attempts to diffuse tension between the East and the West. Whereas in reality, when the Ostpolitik, or the West German, reconciliatory policies towards the Eastern, towards Eastern Europe, including the GDR and the Soviet Union, they're very much opposed to this. It was something they perceived. So it seemed. Whether it was to be taken seriously or not is another question. But the Ostpolitik, the attempt to detente, the attempt to diffuse East-West tension, was always perceived as very, very threatening in China at the time. Whereas then after German unification, that it was all good, and China was always been in favor of this. And even though nobody really cared, and this is I made this very clear in the last chapter of that book, nobody really cared about China's opinions about China's opinion on German reunification in 1989 or 1990. You know, China was not part of the negotiations. China was completely irrelevant as a foreign policy actor. You know, nobody really gave a damn, if you will, about China's opinion on whether it was against or in favor of Germany reunification, because Germany reunification was taking place without China, like it or not, you know, in China. So, but again, you know, that became then the official policy. China has always been in favor of peaceful coexistence, you know, of all forms of peaceful coexistence, and including Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, which is, you know, nothing could be further away from the truth. They were lying, you know, just like East German, you know, politicians were lying. You know, they're liars, you know, notorious liars, and you know, and they had the propaganda apparatuses, you know, backing up the lies with you know, false statistics and you know, falsifying statements made everywhere.
And we have a hand raised by Julia Zablotska. The floor is yours. You should unmute yourself. Thank you.
Oh, excuse me. Hello.
Hey, again, hi. That's how are you?
Hi, great. I wanted to, what Professor Masu already told, to also remind, as I'm also interested in that, to discuss modern relations between Germany and China as well, and any interest, your opinion, and any interest in recent diplomatic events.
Right. So thank you. That's a very important question. Since we have like 12 minutes to go and I don't see any hands raised, I guess we have time for addressing this important question, and perhaps give the floor to one final question or comment at the end. Thank you.
Chisa, did you want to go, Chisa?
Oh, is it for Masuo Sensei? I think was it for Julia? Is it for Chisa? Is it for...
No, Professor Berkofsky.
I was losing there.
She as well asked that question just.
Okay. Just briefly repeat the question, the essence of the question, because I lost you there somewhere.
Modern diplomatic relations between Germany and China, and any interest in recent events in that area.
Can I insert a comment here? Well, it's a related comment. Yeah.
Yep.
Reading Axel's book, at the same time, I was also astonished how thin the bilateral relations were during the international communist, when those parties were doing this international communist movement. Because comparing to China's relationship with other communist parties in Asia, I think China didn't really make the best efforts to win the GDR. Well, China intervened a lot to the interior affairs of many Asian countries and tried to, for example, with the case with Japan Communist Party, China basically split the party because the major group was going for trying to ally with the Soviet Union, but China wanted to drag some people to their side. So the Chinese Communist Party did their best to split the Japanese Communist Party and bring some of the members to their side. And China did basically the same to many Asian countries. But it seems like in terms of the GDR, China has given up that effort. When I think about this, I think maybe we can argue that China tends to see the world as some blocks. China probably regarded the GDR to take the Soviet Union side without any arguments. So that's probably why it didn't make much efforts. But when they were thinking about Asia, China always wanted to create its own bloc in Asia. So that's probably why it made such big efforts in Asian communist parties, or they always try to create more friends beyond the communist relationship. For example, in in Japan, China tried to penetrate into the Japanese society by cultivating many friendship relationship with the regular people, but probably it didn't do that toward East Germany. So probably it might reflect China's current attitudes to many parts of the world today. That was my comment.
Okay.
Axel, please go.
And before you address the question and the comment, we have a final word from one of our participants, Timothy. Sorry for misspelling your surname, Chukwuma Onwuzlike, and I apologize for any mispronunciation.
No, I was just thinking about the comment from Chisako. So for me, when I think about it, why China wasn't like concentrated on the GDR, I think maybe it was an issue of capability. I think maybe the Chinese know that they have the capacity to, project in terms of this close relationship beyond their immediate environment. I think maybe when something like that happened in the history of this Cold War was when China felt they could. For example, there were points at some historical junctures where China tended to want to do something like that in Africa. But at this time, maybe they felt they could do this at this moment. So for me, when I think about it, I think maybe it was about capacity and feeling that they were not really capable of, doing that, taking the relationship more seriously.
Briefly, if you talk about the capacity, there's a contradiction what China did in Africa during 60s. If you think Chinese capacity wasn't big enough, why was China investing so much to cultivate its friendship in Africa during the 60s? So, it seems like China decides where to invest depending on the power structure in the world. Because Africa was far away from other big powers, probably that's why China was investing more. But because East Germany was too close to Soviet Union and much closer to Soviet Union than China, it gave up to make those efforts. That's my guess, but I don't know what Axel think about it.
Yeah, so when I was talking about capacity, I meant capacity in that sense, actually. Like when they feel they could do more in this sense, even I'm not talking about capacity in the real sense of it, because there were, like Professor Axel said, the whole lot of Chinese policy that had no coherence, doesn't make sense. So in terms of capacity, I was talking about where they feel they could make a difference as a result of absence of a real power acting in that region. That is what I meant.
I mean, if I may, Julia, I will address also the talk about Africa and
address all points, and you have 5 minutes on very small questions.
Exhausted. Julia, are you still there? Julia, you're the one on West Germany. Are you still there? Are you still in the room? Okay,
I'm sure she is. I'm sure she is.
Yeah, she's a student of mine from Pavia. And thanks for showing up, by the way. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm really dedicated. I'm really happy about this. West Germany, Julia, when today, if you look at European EU trade with China, 50% of the European Union trade with China is taking place with Germany. Sure, of course, Germany is Europe's biggest economy, and it goes without saying that maybe the larger part of EU trade with China is that's normal. But it also goes back, if you will, maybe until I don't know until what extent this is true. But it is to a certain extent true. In the 1970s, early 1970s, when West German high-ranking politicians like Franz Josef Strauss, a conservative, communist-hating communist hating politician representing BMW and other southern German multinational companies was going to China and saying, look, let's forget about ideology for a while. We have a lot of nice cars, which we would like to have assembled here in China. And there's a lot of West German business interest in China in the 1970s, and this was coming from somebody, from a German West German conservative political elites who grew up, hating communism, hating Soviet Union communism and hating equally Chinese communism. And China became just like Germany, and became very pragmatic about this. They decided, in the 1970s, and also when they of course when the climax of this was the negotiations on diplomatic relations, which then resulted in diplomatic relations in 1972. Was to sideline ideology, to sideline controversial questions, and focus on trade and investment ties. The sort of trade and investment ties we see today, a massive German trade with China and investments, by far the biggest investor within the European Union, is also certainly a result of pragmatic, cynical, albeit cynical West German and Chinese policies in the 1970s. And what West Germany was the ideological enemy. There should have been no rapprochement between communist Germany and imperialist West Germany in the early 1970s. But there was, because the money was to be made, in West Germany, or with West Germany, and not East Germany. This became clear very, very quickly. And the Africa question, Mao Zedong, and we talked about Timothy. He's also a former student of mine from Pavia. You're based in Copenhagen now, right? In Denmark. Okay. Sorry to have lost you here in Pavia, but here we go. Very pragmatic. It's Mao was talking a big game. He was portraying himself, right, Chisa, as the leader of the developing world, the leader of the revolutionary movement. He was talking a big game, in Africa. Was providing the occasional development aid, the occasional arms delivery. But he was talking a big game without really being able to put the money where his mouth is, because China was dirt poor. China was also a developing economy. China was poorer, than many of the countries it supported during the 1950s and 1960s. Today it's different. China is talking a big game. China is again, or still, if you will, the leader of the developing world, but being able to put the money where its mouth is. China is full of money and it's investing all over the place. Maybe the big China investment wave in Africa is going back a little bit, but it's nothing as compared to the actual impact on Africa or on other developing parts of the world in the 1950s and 1960s. So there was Mao was a big talker. He talked a big game without having the resources to really to be acknowledged as the leader of the developing world. And even the leaders of the developing world, the autocrats in Africa and in Central Asia and all over the place, they realized that eventually realized that the sort of revolutionary Maoist policies would bring disaster and nothing but disaster, with a few exceptions, of course. And with Cambodia, of course, which in the 1970s adopted a very radical and radicalized version of Maoism, Leninism in their own country, then only to bring Cambodia to the very brink of complete collapse. But it's different today. It may be going away, and that wave may be going away, and there's a realization also in many African countries today that Chinese trade and investment ties did not lead to the desired diversification of many African economies, and there are too many Chinese workers in Africa, not creating enough employment in Africa. But certainly China is able, in theory or in practice, as we have seen over the last 15 years, to put the money where its mouth is, and not unlike Mao was talking a big game but didn't really have the resources to back up his slogans and his propaganda with money on the table.
Thank you, Axel. Thanks for addressing in 5 minutes 2 continent-sized questions, essentially, and it's been a pleasure to have this book talk and this book presentation with our guest coming from afar, Chisako Masuo. And the book, of course, is coming out right now, and it's coming out in hardcover, in soft cover, in a month or so, if I'm not mistaken.
It's going to be a soft copy in 2 weeks, and the hard copy in a month, roughly.
Fantastic. That's perfect timing for the Christmas holidays. You know what to present your family and friends with. The book is, of
nothing
course.
Else to do. You have a lot of money, nothing else to do. Get that book, you know.
And the book, of course, is China-GDR Relations from 1949 to 1989, The Bad Company You Keep, by Axel Berkofsky and Axel Springer, meeting of two Axels, we are delighted that this conversation has ranged all the way to the contemporary, and thanks a lot for tuning in. You will also get a YouTube video uploaded on their platform, and it will be right on time for the publication of the book. Thanks a lot, guys, and thank you, Axel.
Thank you very much for this.
And thank you, Chisa.